Real privilege me to It is a real privilege for me to host today's first of a kind awareness and action webinar, which is focused on men and mental health, which is a field that I have a very, very deep personal, professional, and academic interest in. I've been with the organization for about 14 years now, and it is super exciting to still, after all these years, get to be part of new and exciting initiatives like this. But fortunately, you won't have to just listen to me today because I'm not alone. I have a panel of excellent guests with me. Very, very warm welcome to my friends and fellow panel guests who've taken time out of their busy days to join me, excuse me, this morning for what I really believe is going to be a rich and informative conversation. And I will give them a moment to introduce themselves shortly. But before I go any further, I do just want to acknowledge that this webinar is taking place on a somewhat ominous and tumultuous day for us in South Africa, where due to the anti-immigration protests that are due to happen across the country, hundreds of thousands of people's mental health and well-being could be suffering today. So on behalf of myself and everyone at the SA Federation for Mental Health, I just want to wish everyone peace and safety during the day and the days to come, and ask that you help spread a message of love and tolerance, and that we collectively fight against violence, hatred, and division. Just a few housekeeping tips, housekeeping points very quickly. This session will run as a discussion between myself and our guests. And in the interest of staying on track and of time, I know we have quite a lot of people in the audience. I'd like to ask you to please make a note if you have any comments or questions. And then at the end of our discussion, my colleague Michele, who is kindly handling the technical side of today's webinar, will assist us with a bit of a Q&A. So if you have any questions, we'll deal with them at the end so as to get through the conversation that we have planned for you today. And may I also lastly just kindly ask that if you're not speaking, please keep your mic on mute so as to limit distractions. So thank you very much for that. So without any further delay, as promised, I'll ask each of my esteemed guests just to briefly introduce themselves, and then we'll kickstart the conversation. I'll go as I see them on the screen. Tshegofatso.
Good day, everyone. Thank you, Leon. Firstly, I just want to thank the Federation for the invite. It is really an honor. And I'd also like to thank everyone who logged on today. Thank you for actively caring about mental health, for taking it beyond words, for wanting to learn and wanting to engage. As you've heard, my name is Tshegofatso Sephula. I am a writer, speaker, and the author of the book Mental Decay. And I am happy to say that I've been able to transform my intense personal battle with mental illness into a mission for awareness. I now aim to empower others, particularly men, to break their silence, embrace their vulnerability, and realize that they are never alone. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tshegofatso. As always, it's such a privilege to have you with us. CJ.
The moment the microphone disappears on the screen and you have to go looking for it. But hello, everybody. My name is CJ. I'm an HPCSA registered counselor. Very excited for today. I want to thank everybody for joining in. As you all know, this is usually a very uncomfortable conversation to have for many. And usually a lot of people aren't willing to start the conversation. But I'm hoping that by listening in, hearing some of the insights, maybe you jump into your own conversations where needed. Thank you very much to Leon as well. And hopefully everybody can gain something out of today's conversation.
Thanks, CJ. Really appreciate it. KG?
Sure. Morning, everyone. Habyane. I host a platform called Man Up Conversations. That is a podcast that is aimed at sharing men's stories. So I've been very interested in just how men are coping in their lives and different things, that the challenges that they face in life. How are they exploring those challenges, right? And what can we learn from each other by sharing these stories? I think in creating the platform, I found that there's a need to hear more of men's stories. We often hear of men in the media in all sorts of lights, right? So I don't want to maybe go into what we're going to be speaking about, but I just generally wanted to give a full-on experience from the men themselves as opposed to hearing it from the reports. And maybe today I'll share a bit of what I've been learning from these conversations that I've been having with Leon and Tshegofatso as well on various platforms. So pleasure to be here.
Thanks, KG. So much appreciated. And then last but certainly not least, unfortunately, he's having problems with his camera, but we have Nelson Mahamba from Central Gauteng Mental Health.
Good morning, Leon and the panel, our audience. I think that introductions are quite often difficult because, I mean, how do you introduce yourself as a person? Do you start with your work that you do and that becomes who you are? Or do you have more things to say so that people get a bit of an understanding as to who you are? But nevertheless, my name is Nelson Mahamba. Let me say that I'm an uncle, I'm a partner, I'm a son to someone, to a mother and a father out there, and I'm a friend to a lot of people. Maybe I'm a colleague to quite a number of people. Currently, I am an assistant general manager at Central Gauteng Mental Health. That's my position, but I'm a qualified social worker. I've spent most of my time dealing with drug addiction, and then there's a mental health field, which is mental illness and mental disability to be specific. So I'm glad and feel privileged to be chosen to be part of this wonderful panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Nelson, and we're very honored to have you here. Okay, so before we start with our conversation and I start asking the guys some of their perspectives, I just want to set the scene very briefly. Why are we here today? June is June is Men's Health Month, and for us here at the South African Federation, it is all about men's mental health. As male suicide rates currently sit at 80% of all suicides in South Africa, it has been declared a national emergency by government. And for us here at SAFMH, we decided that it was prudent to, again, as we did in 2024, focus on the ongoing and global, what they refer to as silent epidemic of male suicide for this month. My esteemed guests are going to help me unpack a lot of important information related to this and to some other topics related to men and mental health. But why is this conversation so important? Just a few headlines. Suicide is a major global health problem with around 730,000 people dying by suicide each year globally, while many more attempt suicide. In 2021, the World Health Organization reported that suicide was the third leading cause of death in persons between the ages of 15 and 29, very alarming. Suicide rates in men are notably higher than in women in almost in all countries across the world, despite women having higher rates of suicidal behavior and thoughts. Men are less often identified as persons at risk of suicide and are more difficult to reach through suicide prevention interventions, even when there are interventions. The warning signs for suicide and deterioration in men's mental health is often not recognized by those within their environments, including professionals. Here in our country, we have approximately 23 suicides per day and around 230 serious suicide attempts that happen every single day. There's a lot of lives that are lost and damaged unnecessarily. And we are also ranked 10th on the list of countries with the highest number of suicide rates. You heard me mention that suicide in men is described as a silent epidemic. And this is due to the fact that it has a distressingly high incidence rate and is a major cause of death in men. And this silent epidemic is perpetuated by a number of factors. For example, there's an overall lack of public awareness of these immensely high rates of male suicides, especially when we look to other more widely publicized threats to men's health, for example, HIV and AIDS. When we look at preventative policies and efforts and campaigns that are developed and evaluated for effectiveness, there are very few that specifically target male suicide. And this further contributes to the lack of visibility of male suicide as a serious public health concern. And then generally, and this is a very important one, is that men, not just in South Africa or Africa, but globally, men are known for their bad help-seeking behavior when it comes to mental health problems. So because men are generally unwilling to seek help for suicide-related problems, and that plus the stigma associated with mental health problems, it really remains invisible. So while research shows us that women are diagnosed more than men with mental health conditions such as depression, men are less likely to speak up about their feelings, often until it's too late. Instead, what men do is they downplay distress that are caused by symptoms of conditions like depression, and they medicate their symptoms with poor coping behaviors like drugs and alcohol, which in turn then increases the risk of mental health conditions. So there's a bit of a vicious cycle happening. So these are just a few things I just wanted to mention, just to kind of set the scene for why we wanted to have this conversation and why we feel, and that I feel, it is really important because there's something very wrong here. Okay. But now let's move on to my esteemed guests to get some of their amazing perspectives on the topic. Tshegofatso, I'm going to start with you. I want you to kickstart the session for us. I've known you for a few years now. You're a very brave and inspirational young man who's walked an often difficult road with mental health. However, you've managed to do incredible work and turn the adversities around. And you are now, as you mentioned in your introduction, an accomplished author of an excellent book. My signed copy lies right here on my desk. You can see Tshegofatso signed it for me the day I met him. You're a speaker, and you've, through your lived experience, become a true advocate for men's mental health. Where and how did the tide turn for you? And what do you think other men in your position can learn from the steps that you took?
So for me, the tide turned because at that point there simply was no other option. I was at the end of my rope, to put it simply. After years of turmoil and a massive trigger, I attempted to take my own life. Fortunately, I failed, but right after the attempt, I found myself in quite an interesting position. There was suddenly this silence after the massive climax, and I had to decide in that silence what would come next. I had to ask myself whether I was going to make another attempt to end it or whether I was going to try and live the life that I was blessed with. Funnily enough, I then began to realize that my problem was not that I wanted to die. It was actually that I really wanted to live, but I was finding it extremely difficult to do under the weight of mental illness. And so that realization actually triggered a massive season of self-discovery and study for me. Because I had now chosen life, I had to figure out how to live better, you know. I had to figure out how I'd walk down a road that led to a suicide attempt in the first place. And I had to understand how I could begin walking a different path. So I stepped outside of myself. Luckily, at this point, I had a lot of time. I wasn't going to work. So I was blessed with time, which is something that not many people do have. But I stepped outside of myself and I began examining my life, my upbringing, my family, my friends, my choices. You know, I asked myself, why do I do what I do? Who do I do it for? What do I want? And most importantly, what don't I want? Do I live out of fear or have I lived out of love? And I essentially became my own case study. And during that, I discovered beautiful things about myself, but also really ugly things about myself. I found that although I had always presented as a confident person, I was actually extremely insecure. I was also extremely shameful and I was fearful. Didn't like myself much. I realized that I did not know what I wanted because I'd lived a life for the approval of others or out of fear that they would abandon me, you know. And I also came to realize that the scared 5-year-old boy who was molested and the boy who had been left by his father had never actually grown up. He was just hiding in the shell of a severely depressed 28-year-old. So for the first time in my life, I spent time getting to know myself. And like I said, we never quite do that, either because life gets in the way or because we're just too afraid to face certain things. It can be scary to face yourself in an honest way. But as I went on relearning myself gradually over time, I was able to start finding different origins for my terrible mental state. And like you mentioned, the bad habits that come with that. And the amazing thing is that as I went through this journey and started facing certain demons, I felt myself becoming more whole. I started to love myself for the first time probably ever in my life. And I started to accept the parts of myself that were in pain. And in doing so, that made space for those pieces to then begin to heal. So to answer your question quite simply, I think one of the best things that people can do is give themselves the opportunity to know and love themselves truly. Know yourself, demons and all, and grow from there, free of judgment from others. You'll start to feel unbothered by the world's expectations of who you should be and what you should do, and you'll be able to set your own pace, which is a luxury in this world. Being able simply to set your own pace for your own life. And that alone removes so much weight from your shoulders and it allows you to tackle this life with a sense of peace and subtle authority.
Man, Tshegofatso, I don't know. I don't know how to follow that. And I'm sure the rest of the audience are in awe as well. I'm just going to quickly promote your book for you again. If you haven't got it,
Thank
if
you.
people, this is the book. I'm sure after hearing that, everybody wants to get a copy of the book. Thank you so much. There was so much profound stuff in what you managed to say in those few minutes, Tshegofatso. I think, and especially for us as men, I think we are so bad at allowing ourselves that space to feel and to be vulnerable and to, face the demons, like you said. And I think it's when that doesn't happen that the dysfunction kicks in and we just spiral and spiral and spiral. So we'll get back to you, Tshegofatso, but thank you. I think you set the scene beautifully for us. Thank you so much. KG, you are a dear friend and colleague of mine, and I've had the privilege of working alongside you on many occasions over the years. You and I often joke that we only find each other when we're having difficult conversations like these, but I guess that's what makes our relationship special. You and I both share a very deep passion for breaking the silence around men and mental health. And in fact, you are normally the one that sits in the facilitator seat during these conversations. So I'm actually stealing your spot today. So I feel very privileged. Through your platform that you mentioned earlier, Manned Up Conversations, you enable absolutely incredible dialogue about a myriad of matters related to men, their vulnerabilities, mental health, etc. Through the hundreds of interviews you've done, what do you think are some of the main vulnerabilities that men hide or struggle with in terms of mental health in particular?
Yeah, no, Leon, thanks to Tshegofatso there. I think he gave us a brilliant sort of setting for what we're exploring and what we're experiencing with the men that I often get into conversations with, But I think at the very beginning, or at the central point of all of this is the issue with fatherlessness, right? We grew up in a country where almost 60%, maybe just over 60% of the country is without fathers. So that in itself says that we have a huge identity issue. Coping mechanisms are not there because we are not taught these coping mechanisms by our fathers, right? The people that are supposed to teach us how to navigate the world out there, right? Mother is very much, we are in the mother's womb from a child and we are in the mother's protection as a child. So we sort of have a safe space and environment where the mother is protective of us. But once we get out there and the elements now start getting involved, I think that's when we start getting lost in well, where do I belong exactly as a man? We have a huge sort of literature or history of heroic men. And we look today, well, where are these heroic men, right? How can I be a hero, right? Because of the changing nature of life in itself, we don't have the same jobs that we used to have back in the days. We can't provide in the same ways that we used to provide, right? Because provision is also being questioned. Well, what is provision? How do we provide, right? How do I provide when my wife is making more money than me, for example, in my home? How do I provide, or how am I there for my child when we are having issues in our relationship, right? And I'm not able to see that child. And what impact does that have on me as this father who is trying? And maybe there are also family issues that come into play where, you are not that the father that we expect. You don't have the means that we want. So you're not accepted into the family as that father. And that leaves that man with a bunch of other issues that then force him to sort of hide, right? To deny some things and suppress a lot of things that he cannot share with his mates. But then, as Tshegofatso rightly said, then those things come out as very negative, right? For example, we're dealing with a lot of shame now, where you are shamed for not being able to contribute in that way, for not being able to show up as this powerful man that we are all taught to be. But how do I wrestle with this powerlessness that I'm sitting with? Right. So if I'm sitting with powerlessness, but all I'm reading about is these powerful men, then how do I fit into that world? So we find that we are struggling to fit into a world that is expected to be a certain way. But when we want to express ourselves differently, then that's also not allowed, right? How's KG now talking about he's vulnerable? I'm not able to provide. I'm not able to be there for my child. What are you talking about? We're living in 2026. You have WhatsApp. You have all of these different needs, right? It sounds so simple. But what about those other things that people do not see that I have to deal with as a man? And I think also, as we speak now about this silent pandemic, right? How do I then allow, or how do I get space to even be allowed to speak on conversations that challenge what most of my other brothers are going through, right? For them, it might be something that's very simple, but for KG, it's something that's very hard. But I think we've taken that and made it sort of a standard that you should be able to cope. And if you do not cope, then there's something wrong with you. There's something not manly about you. And as Tshegofatso rightly said, it's work that we have to do ourselves in instances. We might not even have the people to support us, but how do we then go and do it ourselves? And that becomes a place where then I try to hide and do all of this work by myself without revealing myself to other people. And who's to tell that the work that I'm doing individually is actually helpful? Right? It might be destructive. It might be leading me into a very negative spiral. I might be spending lots of time with people I don't even know on YouTube and whatnot, taking advice from those people. But again, I'm not being witnessed by people who can actually feel my energy when I'm in that space, who can really sense the vulnerability. There's so many spaces available out there for us men. But again, I'm finding that that the access, to find a place where I can be witnessed in my vulnerability and I don't have to perform it, right, in a way that I would do if I go on social media, because I want to be appealing to people. So my energy might be different. I might be talking about something so painful, but I have to act it out in such a way that I get some kind of likes from social media. I get some kind of interest from people, but that takes away from the pain that I'm actually sitting with. So if I can get into a space with Tshegofatso and I can really talk to him and I can see that Tshegofatso can really hear me, can really see me, then I think that changes the conversation from just, an awareness conversation to a real conversation where I really want someone to hear my heart and not even assist me in it, but just hear me and be with me in that moment. And just that witnessing in itself, I think, does a lot. But we are not having a lot of that. But as men's groups are now starting to sort of come together and being built, obviously the spaces that are maybe not doing it so well, but the fact that there's interest, then I'm starting to see that there's a bit of a changing in the conversations that we're having, and a lot more men are now willing to even take a chance. I mean, the other day I put out an episode and I had someone tell me that, let me listen before I kill myself. If you listen to just that, right? And I know that that's an entry point to a conversation, then we can circle back to that a bit later. And thankfully, we had a conversation with that man and he's with another group. So you see that what I'm actually saying here is for me is there are spaces that are just not allowing. There's a conversation that's going on there within our own heads that's not allowing us to uncover whatever is within us. But then also alternatively to that, there are spaces that are saying that, hey, we are here, we are waiting for you. All you need to do is just share your story, and there'll be someone here to hear you at least. And then we can see what we can do with that going forward. Yeah.
Thanks, KG. Absolutely profound, man. I wouldn't expect anything less from you. I think, yeah, you've touched on so many important things. I think those safe spaces, it seems to be something that people are talking about. I did a presentation at a corporate in Pretoria on Friday, and the first question I got from the audience was, how do we create these safe spaces for men? And it was coming from men. So there seems to be more of an appetite kind of developing around, recognizing that we need it. Hey, we need authentic, safe spaces where I can talk to you, I can talk to, a friend or somebody and be, I don't know, let's call it authentically vulnerable, and not have to put on a brave face. I think the other thing I just briefly want to touch on before I go to my next question is just, you spoke about the role of the father and, how we are socialized. And I think we also need to recognize, and this can take us down a whole another rabbit hole, but I think we also need to think about the role of how men are socialized within families, and kind of indoctrinated with masculinity norms around what it is to be a real man and all those kind of things, and that we grow up with, and that inhibits us from showing the vulnerability that you spoke about. But yeah, we'll come back to that. Thanks, KG, really appreciated. CJ, thanks again for joining us today. In your practice as a counselor, on a day-to-day basis, how often do you encounter men who are struggling with their mental health, specifically in terms of just taking those first few critical steps of acknowledging that they might have a problem? And how do you support and encourage men to, and we've just spoken about safe spaces. How do you encourage and support men to feel safe to open up about their struggles? As somebody who, I've had my own journey with mental health problems, and I remember that first step into a psychologist's room was immensely intimidating, and it was really scary. So from your perspective, give us a view.
Oh, it definitely is something that is extraordinarily common in mental health spaces. If we're looking at just from the South African standpoint, even just on a global scale, mental health services is seen as the last resort. It is the final thing after the worst has already happened. It is not seen as what it's supposed to be, which is preventative care. And especially with men, we have this challenge where, this idea of I'll try to fix it myself first before I even approach the idea of asking someone else for help. Now, a lot of the things that I'm involved with, even outside of my practice, such as Watch Me Rise, where we do suicide awareness and prevention activities and things such as DJ Run in November, which is named after our founder's brother who died by suicide. Or even just looking at Headway Gauteng, for instance, where I work with brain injury survivors, which, by the way, are still mostly men. And a lot of this is due to a lot of the mental health challenges and coping mechanisms that we end up having, be that alcohol or drugs, which can cause a lot of these challenges as well, lack of support structures. And that's also one of the things that's quite interesting about this, is we recognize that men have their own social structures, but we also struggle severely as men with having platonic, emotionally connecting friendships. And this is something that I talk about quite often, actually, in my practice, especially with my clients. When we're talking about creating that safe space, when we're talking about showing support, It's about creating that ability to connect. And it is challenging to step into that space because it feels foreign for men to do that. And to take that first step into just asking for help, it's frightening on so many different levels because it's not just about stigma. It's about our own internal sense of identity when we talk about that. Men within our identity see ourselves as strong providers who have to be able to manage our own challenges. And when we're not able to do so, we somehow feel like a failure, and having to go that step further and ask for assistance, it becomes this strife of to what extent do I want to acknowledge my own failure as a man? And we know by now it's not failure. We know that it takes an intense amount of strength to reach out for help, to reach out for support. It takes much more strength than weakness to get to that point of asking for help. And for us to create that space, it's about having those honest conversations and very direct conversations, to be quite frank. We want to skirt around terms that make us feel inferior in a way. But what I found by creating that space, creating that step forward, is direct conversation. Are you feeling like you want to hurt yourself? Have you had thoughts about ending your own life? Have you had challenges with putting down the bottle? Do you feel like you're not enough in this space? Those direct questions that allow for a conversation to go further without skirting around the topic are vital for us because we do everything that we can to not talk directly about it, to not acknowledge the challenge that we have. And for us with men, what we see, I mean, we oftentimes have this lack of emotional awareness, this struggle with introspection, and quite frankly, we lack the needed vocabulary to explain our own experiences oftentimes as well. And this is because, like you said, how we're raised. We're not raised to connect emotionally. We are not raised to speak about what our experiences are, what our emotions are. So when a man comes in and they have to take those first few steps, it is oftentimes about having a very direct conversation, allowing someone to feel that they're able to have these conversations safely, and to, through these direct conversations, develop a vocabulary and ability to introspect and vocalize the challenges that they have. And after we've done that, we can focus on the practical aspects of coping mechanisms and have deeper conversations eventually within that. But it is a slower process. It is something that has to start with a foundation that oftentimes is lacking in that sense of ability to just say, this is my challenge. This is where I'm struggling. This is what I need help with. And it's just about trying to be able to further that conversation from there.
Thanks, CJ. That's really excellent. So I really like the way, what I really took from what you said is that thing about like calling a spade and asking those direct questions. Because what I found, if I reflect on my own experiences, the very first time I went to therapy, was that the therapist was kind of darting around the issues and waiting for me to come out and say, this is what I'm struggling with, or this is what I'm feeling. And I didn't, like you said, I didn't have the vocabulary to do that. I didn't know how to circumvent or overcome these vulnerabilities and these stereotypes. I come from the conservative Afrikaans culture where there is zero, there was zero space for vulnerability and being soft when we grew up. It was like, you think about showing vulnerability, you're a sissy. So walking into a therapist's room, how on earth do I show that vulnerability? And I think it's really important that clinicians and therapists and even GPs understand that if there are signs that are exhibited of a male struggling, that they need to be confident to ask those pertinent questions, because us guys, we don't always have the vocabulary, the confidence to know how to say, actually, you know what, I'm not okay. So I really appreciate that. Thank you, CJ. And then last but certainly not least, Nelson. I know we can't see you, but we can hopefully hear you. I'm very keen to hear your perspective because you have a very unique perspective because you lead social work initiatives at the absolute grassroots level on a daily basis in communities that are very often marginalized, underserved, and where there simply, as we know, aren't sufficient mental health services for those who need it. Now, given how difficult it already is for men to access mental health services because of all the things we've spoken about, how do you deal with such challenges in resource scarce settings when there might, let's say, there is a guy who might be willing to look for support and take those crucial first steps, but actually the support and the assistance is not available to help make that transition at a community level? What do you do in such a case?
Thanks, Leon. Look, I would like to answer that question maybe in a slightly different, let's say, different direction. And I would answer that question with with another question. And my question is, I don't know how much trouble we're gonna get into after saying what we are saying about men, about other men. I think that if I'm look, I'm in the privileged position because I get to listen to every other man that has spoken, and maybe I can combine, let's say, certain things. And I think that the challenge goes as far as if we look at, the webinar that we have now, we can always ask, where are the men? If we're looking at our attendees, do we have more men than women? And the most obvious answer, you would probably find that men are out there doing something probably that we think it's important. Other than obviously what CJ has said, taking care of, our own mental health. If I'm looking at what, let's say, what Tshegofatso said, just after sort of like the tipping point or the climax that he had, he obviously went to a self-discovery journey where he had to face his demons and maybe to uncover, his own self. But you would clearly pick up from that point that he did not go to consult a professional or a psychologist, social worker, counselor, so that tells you now that we are sitting with a real problem, where what KG is saying, about the safe space issue, about what CJ is saying about, are we actually able to look or introspect into ourselves and be able to articulate what is really going on with us and be able to connect what we're going through, maybe, and put it into words. So in different communities, what you often see, especially with us, I mean, there are quite a number of institutions, that have sort of like risen up in terms of focusing on trying to help or currently helping with mental health. But in under-resourced communities like your townships, your Soweto, your Tembisa, your Springs, your sort of like Tetrams to a certain degree, we conduct awareness about mental health challenges, mental illness to a certain degree, with maybe fathers, mothers who are struggling with children who are born with mental disability. But the turnout of men initiating, seeking help, it's very low. But what we see across, let's say, many areas that we cover in Gauteng is that often when we get contact with men, it's always them being referred by an institution. So either they're in court, um, and then there's a case of domestic violence, and now they need to seek mental health because the court has picked up that there is a mental health issue that a man is going through. It could be coming from work that we had this brilliant accountant here or social worker there, or engineer there, whatever the profession could be. and now all of a sudden he has dipped or comes to work tested positive for alcohol, and work now has referred him to a mental health institution. Or now someone is diagnosed with bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and now they need to access mental health. So, what I'm actually attributing to is that, with men, as you would relate, there's never them, or there's never us. Let me not say them and exclude myself. There's never us initiating. There's always a reason behind why we landed up with a therapist or with a counselor, with a social worker, or they're either like boys kicked out at school. Now they need to go to see a therapist so that they can be counseled about maybe the violence that is taking place at home, or the fact that he was growing up without a father, as KJ was saying, the fatherlessness, and he's trying to discover himself as a boy. And unfortunately, there's other habits that are surfacing, which are quite unacceptable. So, would just say that they're antisocial. So there's always those reasons for men accessing mental health in different communities. Whatever office you go to, there's that particular reason, but it's never men out of their own accord seeking mental health in different communities. But what we do is that, as much as we, like I said before, we do go out in different communities. It doesn't matter, where it is. The 10 out of men speaking about mental health or accessing mental health after the information they've received is very low, except when there's a very like a mandatory or like a legal reason why they need to. And if you look at it, with men, for example, it's actually seldom that I would go to CJ and say, "Hey CJ, how about we hang out today?" It's always me and CJ and the third thing. So let me just put it here.
Thanks, Nelson. I think you've for this round of the conversation, I think you've touched on the very basic need that I think all the speakers have in some way alluded to. And I think what you've said is quite profound in terms of, at a community level, it's often not somebody who just wants to come for a conversation, but it's through a referral because something has already gone wrong, be it through the court or through, whatever. So I think what I'm taking from this whole round is that, from what you're saying, is that there's not that spontaneous reaching out. I think, Tshegofatso, you are perhaps the exception to the rule in terms of, having done that introspection and having, come out with a positive outcome. But I think what I'm hearing, and if I'm thinking about, well, what do we need to do, is around, we need to be socializing boys and men to understand the safe space concept that KG was talking about. The CJ, your stuff around vocabulary, and Tshegofatso, your concept of introspection. We need to be fighting the male stereotypes and the masculinity norms that tell us that those things are not okay for men, and actually what is needed is a society of men who are taught that it is okay to express a full range of emotions. So because what often happens, it's okay to be angry, or it's okay to be frustrated. We teach our boys, but it's not okay to cry. So there isn't a full expression of emotion across the full spectrum. So yeah, I think for me, the need to socialize, and I guess it starts at home, but in schools, in communities, we need to socialize our boys and our men to teach them that it's okay to be vulnerable. But I guess the million-dollar question is, how do we do that on a large scale? And I don't have the answer right now. But yeah, thanks, guys. Thank you so much for your inputs. I'm going to carry on, if that's okay with everybody. We've still got some time left. I'm going to go back to Tshegofatso. I want to go to you again. We know that depression in men often goes untreated for various reasons. And I'll quickly just mention what we're talking about. Depression in men can often look different than it does in women. So while we think of traditional depression symptoms in terms of sadness, low energy, low mood, in men, depression can often manifest as anger, irritability, substance abuse, actually the polar opposite of what we consider to be depression. So that's one of the reasons why it often goes untreated. We find that some diagnostic tools or screening tools that are used to screen for depression often don't pick up male depression. And then there is the general propensity of men not to want to seek help. So depression often goes undiagnosed and untreated, which in turn then sadly leads to the massively elevated levels of suicide we see. Tshegofatso, in your book subtitle, I remember the day I got it, it caught my eye, and when I was thinking about this session, I looked at your book again. In the little subtitle, you talk about that devil called depression. Tell me, thinking about men and depression, tell me about that devil called depression from your perspective.
The words depression and depressed, I believe, get tossed around too casually nowadays. Someone doesn't get tickets to a concert they want to attend, or they have Wi-Fi issues, and they'll say, "Oh my gosh, I'm so depressed," And things like that over time begin to soften the seriousness and intensity that something like depression needs to be approached with. So I chose the word very intentionally. I chose to liken depression to the devil because it was important to me to highlight its severity and urgency. Furthermore, I found in my experience, at least, that there were certain characteristics that the two have in common in terms of our understanding of the devil. Like the devil, a lot of the time, depression presented to me as a constant voice in my head, preaching lies, like that little horned devil we see in cartoons on your shoulder. It was exactly like that. The devil is famously known as the father of lies, and my depression kept whispering to me that I was not good enough, telling me that no one loved me, and that if they actually knew me, they would eventually leave, like your father did. That's what it would keep saying. It kept telling me constantly that there was no point to all of this. I would look around at life, at the world, and that voice just said, there's no point to all of this. I would be better off just exiting this life. It told me that I particularly just don't know how to live this life, and I should just cut my losses and call it a day, basically. And this was the voice in my mind 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for years. And another trait that the devil and depression have in common, I've found, is that they're both destructive. So in order to numb and drown out these whispers in my mind, I would smoke weed, drink, watch porn, just to drown that all out, just to numb myself. And these vices would inevitably make me feel even more depressed. And soon I was on what felt like a never-ending cycle, and I was unable and unfit to live any kind of productive life. I must have spent about 3 years predominantly in my bed with these vices. I would get out of bed to go to the front door to get the weed or the food or the booze delivered. Which is great about this delivery system. It really gave way to my depression in a way. But I think it's very important to note that depression is not only being unable to get out of bed, it is also the terrible habits that you adopt in order to cope, numb, and drown. And after some time, you wake up to realize that you are surrounded by a life of ruin and destruction. And like you said, it does present differently in men. And like the devil, you mentioned anger, which is an extremely destructive emotion that is born out of depression, very much so in men. And I think there are some uncanny parallels between the devil and depression. And to put it plainly, the devil attempts to poison all that is good. And I've found that the same can be said about depression. But fortunately for me, I believe that there is a way to defeat the devil. There is a way to defeat depression, and that is through truth and light. And that's why I think it is so important to speak out. It is crucial to share your truth and bring it forth from that darkness and out into the light. And I've seen, at least in my experience, that in doing so, it begins to lose its grip and it begins to lose its power.
Thank you so much. Again, you're a difficult act to follow, my friend. I can see why you write books. Thank you so much. That really, I've never had the opportunity to ask you about that, and I'm so glad. Thank you for sharing that so openly with all of us. I'm sure everybody really. I was hanging on your every word and thinking, yes, that makes absolute sense. It makes absolute sense. And it's important that we talk about depression because of the massive link between depression and suicide. CJ, again, going to you as a practitioner, I know we've sort of covered this, but maybe there are some things that are missing. What are some of the signs that you look out for in terms of depression or even suicidal ideation when you work with men in your practice? Are they, because I'm thinking of our audience now, are there some specific warning signs that loved ones, colleagues, friends can look out for that might be very subtle to notice or that, you might want to make people aware of?
Definitely, I think when we're talking about expressions of depression and expressions of suicidality or suicidal ideation, which is the thoughts, not necessarily the risk of suicide, but where the thoughts of suicide start, they present somewhat differently in men than what we generally kind of think will pop up when we talk about suicidality and depression as well. Men have a bit of a muted approach, I would say, oftentimes. It's a lot more usually in line with kind of the boys will be boys statements. You'll generally find the muted emotions are there most of the time, but then at the same time, you'll have angry and violent and frustrated outbursts over crying and sadness. You'll have withdrawal, but withdrawal won't look like a person in a dark room. It would look like the husband and father going to the same chair in the house every single day and sitting there in quietness. It would look like someone who becomes overactive with their work and with their hobbies, trying to distract themselves continuously. There is this part of depression that we always talk about where we get this picture of someone who is just stuck in a dark room doing nothing. Whereas what we need to remember, and I'm actually going to liken this a lot to our more African kind of approach to mental health, is that in community-oriented cultures, such as that of South Africa, we are very purpose-driven. We continuously liken ourselves and our sense of worth to our sense of value to the community, to our families, to what we need to present ourselves as. So for us, becoming depressed or having feelings of suicide is oftentimes linked to feeling that we are somehow worth less. So we become overproductive. We become preoccupied with hobbies and with socialization and with our work. So for a lot of other people might look like very healthy signs. This person has a passion for their job. They're always around their friends. They're constantly seeking to be busy. Can sometimes be a sign for us, especially if this kind of comes out of the blue, where a person steadily starts to build up their work hours, steadily starts to preoccupy themselves more with their friends, with drinking or with sport, stepping away from their families, having less emotional connections with their friends, and that's purely just linked to socialization, for instance. These are some of those warning signs that we can experience within men that run contrary to what we sometimes expect. There are definitely other signs that are more general that we experience, such as, yes, heightened levels of porn or substance abuse, or just being less likely to have general conversations. One of the other ones is also a challenge with solving problems, to be quite frank. The more we experience mental health challenges, the less our brain is able to process things. So we either become avoidant of specific topics, we talk less about certain things, we take longer to solve problems, which then builds on our frustration and our sense of feeling worthless and helpless. So these are things that we can sometimes look out for beyond the general signs that we know, which is essentially that lethargic nature that we can have, the insomnia or hypersomnia, which is either struggling to fall asleep or constantly sleeping. And this is also something I'd like to point out within South Africa, because we as men oftentimes lack the vocabulary or the willingness to say, I am feeling so emotionally low. The one sentence that I would like to draw a lot of people's attention to is if you're constantly hearing someone say, I am just tired. To us, that is our sentence. That is the South African equivalent of I am feeling low, I am feeling depressed, is if you're constantly and always hearing, I am just tired. I don't want to do that. I'm just tired. That becomes a bit of a warning sign to let's have a bit of a deeper conversation. Where is this tiredness coming from? Is it just work? Is it family life? Is it a combination? And we can take that a bit further. But beyond that, it is also just our focus on substance abuse, for instance. South Africa is one of the leading alcoholic nations in the world, for instance. And even with substances, it's not always heavy substances. It can be, but usually it's alcohol, it's weed, it may be sleeping tablets. It could be various forms of uppers that are available, which can be your things like cocaine or ADHD medications or so on, that help a person either function more effectively or sleep through the problem. And this also faces back into that sense of helplessness. These are the biggest signs that we can look for in those areas themselves. But what I can say is one of the biggest things for us when we are looking and seeing these signs, the best thing that we can do is, one, again, be willing for that uncomfortable conversation. And beyond that as well, we often have a word we use in psychology, which we call unconditional positive regard, which is a very fancy way of saying to learn to have these difficult conversations without judgment, to allow space for a person's experience and acceptance of that experience, to work towards that sense of understanding so that someone can feel safe enough to have those conversations. And that becomes necessary with these signs because these are not conversations we're used to having. We are telling someone, you've been putting in so much work recently. Is there something you might be distracting yourself from? It sounds odd to have that. Like, you've been so productive. What's going on? It sounds weird, right? But we have to have those conversations. But before I blabber on too long into this question and topic, I'm going to hand back to you, Leon.
Thanks, CJ. I mean, that was fantastic. I think you, in 5 minutes or whatever, really captured such a wide spectrum of things that people can be aware of. And I love the way... Sorry,
why should I? I've done it for you, but why should I? What's wrong with you that you can't do it for yourself?
Sorry, can you please put yourself on mute? Excuse me, can you please put yourself on mute? Somebody's not on mute and it's very distracting. Thank you. Siobhan, I think it might be you. Would you mind muting yourself, please? Michelle, I don't know if you're able to mute. There we go. All right. Sorry about that. Kind of lost my train of thought there. CJ, I think what I loved about what you said was how you contextualized it to us as South Africans and how we express in our own cultural way, in our own cultural vocabulary, in our own cultural behaviors, these kinds of symptoms that people can look out for. And I'm so glad that you touched on the one that is about people immersing themselves in activities and seeming overly productive when actually that can be a symptom of something like depression. So I'm sure everybody really found that very informative. I have a ton of questions left and we're running out of time because you guys are just making such amazing contributions. So I'm going to just push for a little bit of time. KG, I'm going to go to you. I want to ask, as a master of storytelling and getting men to share about their journeys and their struggles, you've seen storytelling helping men to break the silence around mental health and overcome some of the widely pervasive stereotypes and stigmas that so often silence and damage men. And we know from working in the mental health field, Michelet, my colleague who's here today, is also a master storyteller. We know that storytelling is a key tool to combating stigma. But what are some of the kind of stereotypes that so often silence and damage men, or even lead to suicidal thoughts or behaviors? What are some of those stereotypes that men out there grapple with?
Yeah, and I think, thankful to CJ for bringing in a lot of those different elements. I think they just widen the conversation a bit. We have very typical responses to that, the big boys don't cry type of messaging. But I think within that, Leon, what I find is the questions, the questions that we ask around these stereotypes. Where do those questions lead us, right? If I ask a man, well, what do you mean big boys don't cry? What does that mean to you? I think then I get a very different understanding of what that means to that man, as opposed to it means you shouldn't go to therapy, right? We spoke about regulation, emotional regulation. There's certain emotions that, as a Black guy growing up in South Africa, taking on the history of our country, there's certain emotions I'm sort of not allowed to sort of express in certain spaces, right? We spoke about anger, for example. We often speak of anger in such a negative light. You shouldn't be an angry man, but anger is very necessary. What if something happened to me that I have to acknowledge that I'm really angry about this thing? But as soon as I get angry as a Black guy, again, depending on which context I'm in, depending on the environment that I'm in, it's very threatening to some people, right? They're very uncomfortable with that. So I have to then suppress my own anger to make people comfortable. And that doesn't work for me. That then really works against me, because then I'm not really allowed to then express or be in touch with the full range of emotions that I have access to as a man, right? Again, it's an angry Black man now trying to tear down whatever's going on in the office, right? Because I had an issue with such and such a manager or a boss, I can't really express that, because then there are also racial dynamics within that, right? Maybe it's Leon, who's a white guy, and I'm trying to tell him that, you don't really necessarily understand my context, right? So I think in what we're talking about now, a lot of it is focusing only on the individual. But then what about the environments that we work in, the systems that we work in? Are they also taking into consideration my history, right? Where I come from? Do they understand my context as a Black person, as a white person, as a young or older person? I think those things also play into what we are allowed to express or not express, and then the types of help or the solutions that are available for us, or the solutions that can be then sort of be tailored to those specific men in those spaces. So I think that's one thing that, stories allow us to hear the dynamism of this person, right? I'm not just Habyane, who's a podcaster, but I'm Habyane, who's also unfathered, who's never really learned ways to regulate myself. I've had issues with jobs. I've had issues with relationships. You see that when I start to unpack all of those different departments of my life, then I can see I can really approach this man from so many different angles, as opposed to a man who just doesn't cry, right? So I think that gives us so many more dynamics. And again, when Tshegofatso was speaking to voices, what voices do we listen to? We spoke of the voice of the devil, right? But again, if we look at depression is telling me that I'm actually living a life that is possibly not mine. This is not the life that I need to be living. And if I listen to that voice of depression, I can then, get in conversation with that. I can get curious about that depression, which I think is what Tshegofatso did, but what is actually going on there, which is what CJ would do in a therapy session, right? Start to question and what messages have been internalized by the specific man. So what I'm learning is I'm finding that there's a whole lot of different, a range of issues that are coming up, some that I've never even imagined. Tshegofatso spoke about being molested or abused as a child. For many men, they've never even had that conversation with anyone. So imagine you are 65, 75, 45, and you've never said to anyone that, hey, when I was 5 years old or 10 years old, such and such happened to me. And I grew up with this big secret that forces me to constantly be on guard, constantly hide, constantly want to make well for everyone else, want to make everyone comfortable. but myself very much uncomfortable in those spaces, right? So I think we're walking around also among ourselves with assumptions of what these men are, what these men are going through, but we are not asking enough questions, as CJ said, and very direct questions, right? What is going on with you, man? and what's seriously going on with you, right? I'll make an example. Just last year, here in Atteridge, just 5 minutes from my house. So I went up, I've got a few mates that I hang out with. I often have these very uncomfortable conversations with them. And I love that one of the guys is on the spectrum, right? So he's got a bit of bipolar, a bit of this and that, all kinds of things going on with him. And we often tease him about these things, but he loves that because he can educate us at the same time, right? So it's a very interesting exchange. So I said that, hey, there's a mental health event going on down the road. Do you guys want to go see what's going on there? We head down, there's 3 of us, right? When we get there, they you can sign up to get checked for this and that. You can go there, queue up to get tested for, your mental health, physical health, other ailments and all of that. One of our guys stood back and he didn't want to engage in it, right? He just stood back and he watched soccer and all the other activities that are going on. And we thought, okay, that's a good opportunity to talk to that guy. And we walked up to him and asked him, dude, how come you're not interested in all of this? Because just the other day, you were telling us that you are not doing well. We actually came here because of you. And he said, yeah, I think there are too many people here for me to try to go there. I don't want to be seen in that, right? So again, speaking to this conversation of safe spaces, I think before I bring myself into a safe space, I need to find a safe person. Can I find a safe person first? And then maybe I can go into a space, For a lot of us, we've been hurt by these so-called safe spaces, these so-called communities, right? We often say that community is where a lot of healing happens. But what if I've been hurt by people within my own community? What if my own community doesn't recognize me as someone who's in need of help, but they're calling me crazy? So what about those other dynamics? What about that man who's constantly drinking and all we're saying about him is all kinds of negative stuff, but we never really stop to say, but hey man, and that is such and such, what is going on? And some of us know the stories around this guy's family and history and all of that, but we use that to dehumanize that person further. So I think in going and speaking to men and really finding these stories, what is going on, asking questions, really being curious about these men is when we get to learn different things, not even the things that we get to learn in some of the publications that have been put out, in the journals that have been put out. So I guess in my way of closing this is for me, the question then would have to, again, move from just the individual, but let's look at the context the individual lives in. And I think with that, we have a lot more story to work with. And those stories then can unearth so many more different things that can help us relate better to that person. Again, judge the person a lot less, humanize the person. And I think once we've gotten those things right, then we can move into, well, how can we help this person? How can we find solutions that, again, are not dehumanizing, that are not, can I call them repressive, are things that are forcing this person to go into spaces that are a little bit too stretchy for them. Can it honor their culture as well? And I think, I can leave it there for now.
Thanks, KG. I think you touched again on so many really crucial things, like looking at the wider societal context and the systems, but also then on the flip side, looking at what you were saying, finding not a safe space, but a safe person. And I think that's really, really crucial. And I guess it's about looking at getting that 360 perspective of people. And I've seen in the work that Michelet does when she does storytelling with people with lived experience of mental health conditions, the moment you start giving people that opportunity to tell their whole story, you get this wealth of knowledge and you get this depth of understanding. But it takes time. And it takes courage as well for people to feel comfortable with that. Thanks for that, KG. I'm very conscious of time and that I'm sure there'll be some questions, and I still have a few questions left. So I'm gonna just fire two last questions. I'm sorry for my panel. I had lots of more questions for you, but I just want to ask a few that I think are really pertinent to this particular conversation. CJ, I'm just quickly going to go to you, and I just want to say to you, or I want to ask you, and guys, if I can ask you just to keep your answers fairly short, just in the interest of time, so we can get to Q&A. What do you think societies, and when I talk about societies, I include families, loved ones, employers, colleagues, whoever, what can people practically do to help address the high levels of male suicide? What can I, as an individual, do on a daily basis in my daily life to try and help fight this massive pandemic we're facing?
Well, I always feel like this kind of question is one of those where you're being asked to cure world peace or create world peace or so on.
I'm sorry.
No, definitely not a bad one, and it's a good one. I oftentimes my response to this, if I could have a perfect answer for this, I would slap it on a brochure and I would be able to send this out to everybody. But it is such a nuanced thing to look at society as a whole. Men have their own experiences to a large extent, and their own culture that they're within, and their own lived experience. I think the biggest things that we as society and family members can do is to not shy away from proper conversations. That is the biggest part. Men oftentimes feel that we cannot have these conversations because we will not receive support. We'll receive criticism. And for us just to be more willing to listen and support without criticizing, without stating that as a man, someone should be able to do something, without saying, you're now having this challenge, how are we going to feed the family, or what are we going to do with this? Instead of just listen. Don't try and fix the problem for someone necessarily, because that's also the other thing. People somehow feel that if I speak up, they're just going to throw solutions at me. They're not going to hear me. They're not going to help me. And as a society, the only thing for us is to start to show acceptance, to start to show willingness to listen and a willingness to support without judgment. To first come from a place of, I care for you, I love you, you're allowed to speak, you're allowed to speak with me, and to be there. And from another part for men, for us to stop shying away from proper conversations. Let's not jump to, let's just go grab a beer. Instead, let's say, let's sit and talk. Let's form a proper connection that goes beyond socialization, that goes into those deeper conversations. I believe as a society, that's where we can start. The other part of it is if we're talking about marginalized communities, which, yes, oftentimes goes into protecting women and children, but if we're having conversations around GBV, for instance, let's talk about the mental health challenges in men that lead to GBV as well. Because that is where a lot of this does start. A lot of the challenges we face within our government, within our economy, within our people, starts with men's mental health challenges not being responded to appropriately within policy and public conversations, and not being included in those conversations in a large extent. So once we start including these conversations in the more public space, allowing people to talk without judgment or fear of judgment, and as family members and friends show support, that is where we can make that big difference.
Thanks, CJ. So again, there's a golden thread running throughout what you guys are saying. And I can't remember the fancy word you used earlier, but I'm going to call it listening without judgment. I can't remember what you called it earlier, but I think if we can get people to start doing that, I think we would make massive strides in this field. If we can get people to start ignoring those traditional societal stereotypes and masculinity norms of what makes a real man, and actually just listen and create safe spaces, be the safe person for somebody, we can hopefully start making strides. I've got 2 questions left. I'm going to ask my panelists to just quickly answer them for me, if that's okay. Nelson, I want to come to you. I want to come back to you very briefly because, again, you work at community level. What do you think community-based mental health care, such as the services provided by Central Gauteng Mental Health, can play in suicide prevention programs? What do you think, what unique role do you think providers of community-based mental health care can play? Just briefly.
I think that, I mean, when I think about it, I think that we definitely would need to change the model, because obviously the current model is just not working. In what I've mentioned earlier, in terms of going out there, doing community awarenesses, making therapy available, because it is already there, but it doesn't prove to be working. And I think that in terms of all, let's say, parties, or let's say professionals that are involved, I think maybe what we would then need to do is to take men such as CJ, take Kgaugelo, out there, and allow men to just come forward, because we actually seldom share the struggles or the victories that men actually have, and allow communities to obviously have the direct, or allow men particularly, because we actually talking about, allow men to ask the questions that they want to ask. And I think that then the role of the professionals would be to see how best can, if a man talks about having struggled with, let's say, depression, and obviously from our side we know that we can write referrals, in terms of someone seeing a psychiatrist, getting medication. If that is the case, then we do that. But we need to then stop leading what maybe men need out there, and let men sort of dictate the role as to what do they see is the solution to this problem. And obviously, I mean, I'm not saying that professionals should step away, but should maybe play a bit of a silent role instead of a leading role.
Okay. Thanks, Nelson. So, I mean, I guess, uh, as someone who works closely with the community mental health care space, what I can see following this conversation today, what it's again kind of reiterated in my mind, is how providers of community-based mental health care can be the bridge between the professionals like the CJs, and the guy sitting at home not knowing where to go, and helping to bridge, and perhaps through some purposeful hand holding and facilitation, creating again, and keep going back to this kind of safe space where men can become more vulnerable and open, and kind of have these conversations, and through the services provided at community level, perhaps then access the more clinical services if needed, or professional services. So I do really see you
100%.
guys as the bridge between the guy stuck at home not knowing where to go, and the CJ sitting who's there to help. And I think that's a really
100%.
key role for community-based mental health care. My final question, Tshegofatso, you started us, and I'm going to end with you. You are what I like to refer to as the expert by experience. You've lived this in every single way. What words, in closing, what words do you have for men out there who might be listening to this, and who might be on the cusp of breaking the silence and taking those difficult but powerful first steps that you took? How do we encourage, or what I would say, how do we encourage courage, for want of a better phrase, and bravery in men to overcome their struggles, these masculinity norms that they've been indoctrinated with? And how do we, to help them become such articulate, powerful mental health advocates like yourself, who are not ashamed or afraid to talk so openly about the roads that they've traveled?
Okay, so I just want to tell a very brief story here to illustrate my advice to those who may need encouragement or that extra push. So one night I was with three of my friends, and we were having a few drinks. This was at the height of my mental health issues. I was obviously drinking a bit more than them, and probably why I felt like sharing that evening, and I felt quite vulnerable. And for the first time ever, I pretty much laid everything out on the table to these three friends of mine. I told them about what had happened to me as a child. I told them about how much I was struggling, how depressed I was, and how empty I felt. I poured my heart out, and I cried for the first time in front of my friends, for the first time ever. And after I spoke, there was silence and sad faces for a moment. And in that moment, I felt scared. I expected judgment, and I expected for them to look at me as though I was damaged. But the two words that followed changed my life forever. One of my friends, Brandon, he took my hand, he looked me in my eye, and he said, "Me too." He said, "Me too." Instantly, those words gave me love, comfort, courage, and hope. And most importantly, they showed me that I was not alone. Instantly, I had a community to draw strength from, and I had shoulders to lean on as I fought. So, my message to those who are scared is that no matter what you have done, and no matter what you have gone through, I promise you, you are not alone. Many of us have gone through and done the same. I urge you to speak out. Yes, there may be people who misunderstand, there may be those who judge, but by speaking out, you will find your community and you will gain strength, love, and power. I promise you, you are not alone. There are many of us just waiting to say, "Me too." So please speak out.
Thank you so much. I mean, that's great. And I think that that's such a powerful message that we advocate for in the mental health space. That thing about you're not alone. It's okay not to be okay, and you are not alone. There are other people who face similar things. Guys, I actually don't have words to properly thank you for your incredible perspectives and the points you've shared. And I'm so sorry that we have to cut this conversation short. I could have kept this going for another 2 hours. But yeah, thank you so much. And just before we head over to Michelet to hear about questions or so, I just want to just summarize very quickly from our side. Just to say that every suicide is a tragedy and to some degree a mystery that impacts on families, communities, entire countries, and that has long-lasting effects on those who are left behind. But despite the fact that it is such a widespread issue, it can be prevented. And I really hope that this webinar, even though it was only an hour, just over an hour, I hope that it has shown our participants that there's hope, because as long as we have hope, we can continue the fight. And I hope that it has equipped people with some interesting knowledge, it's inspired people, and it's given people some useful tips. And I just want to reiterate again that with adequate support and treatment, suicide is absolutely preventable. But it's up to me and to you, everybody and everyone, to take steps and to follow some of the amazing advice we had here today. Sadly, there is a silence that continues to hang over men and mental health, but I feel as if we're starting to lift the curtain by having these conversations and by showing men that it's okay to talk about these things. And we need to carry on breaking the silence through public awareness, through having these kinds of events. And I also want to urge those of you who listen today to take this bravery that you've seen here and that you've heard about and to take it into your own lives, to speak up, whether you're male or female, speak up, challenge societal stereotypes and masculinity norms that harm men and prevent help-seeking behavior, and help us battle those horrible stereotypes that teach us that it is unmanly or that it is a weakness to ask for help, because we cannot continue losing lives to suicide. Michelet, I'm going to bounce over to you. I know we are running out of time, but let's see if we can take a few questions, if that's okay with everybody. Even if we run over for 5 minutes, I'm sure people won't mind.
Sure. Thanks, Leon. And thank you to the speakers and all the attendees. We can see that there was a lot of engagement, and everything that was said was really impactful, as lots of people have been commenting. There's been a lot of comments, so yes, speakers can feel free to read through. But in terms of questions, I noted two so far, and I'll keep going through. The first one is from Kamo, and it says, how can we create a culture where men feel just as comfortable talking about their mental health as they do about their physical health?
I'm going to be cheeky and throw that one to. I see you've got your hand up. I was just going to throw it your way. KG.
Yeah, thank you, Leon. I think in for what I'm beginning to realize is we talking about mental health and this thing of saying that 1 in 4, putting out this number that this in that have mental health issues or struggle with mental health issues makes people then want to sit on the side of the ones that don't have mental health issues, right? But if we speak about everyone has a mental health or struggles with some kind of mental health issue, whether we know it or not. But I think the idea of just having the conversation of speaking to where you've been challenged, where you've struggled in life, where you've struggled to cope, that's when we move the language away, maybe from mental health to speaking about just general living. Where have you not been able to manage or to cope with a certain thing? And I think in that, then we can come with a mental health, more diagnostic, psychological language. But the more we use terms like depression, anxiety, and all of that, we all sound like doctors, and everyone wants to run away from that language. So the more we simplify the language, but then again, as CJ said, but we speak to the real issue and dodge and stop apologizing or trying to make nice of a very uncomfortable situation, then I think we can get to the honesty and the truth that we need to speak to, which is, in a sense for me, a mental health conversation. So I'd argue that many of us have had these conversations, we've just maybe not labeled them as mental health issues or challenges. So that for me, the idea is to get into conversation, but be honest, as you said, be transparent and own your story. I think once you've owned your story, then I think it's easy for you then to be able to connect with another person's story because there is no hiding or wanting to be something that you are not in that.
Thanks, KG. And I think what is so important in what you said, and I think it's a crucial message that needs to be out there, is that people need to recognize that mental health is not something that sits separate from the rest of your health. Mental health and physical health are two parts of the same coin, and you can't have one without the other. And I think the more we realize that actually it's not optional, your mental health, if you have the flu or bronchitis, you're going to go see a doctor. If you're not feeling well, you're feeling depressed, you're feeling like you want to take your own life, you need to look for professional help. And it's about demystifying and destigmatizing that road to support that I think is so essential. Michelle, what other questions did we have? I think you're on mute, Michelle.
Thanks, guys. Sorry about that. Just saying, yeah, quite a few more questions coming through. I see hands up as well. But the second question that had come through is from Colleen. It says, if men are notoriously reluctant to seek help, how do we create a culture within the workplace to make men feel they have a safe space to seek help and to support one another? EAP programs within organizations often have a much higher female client base than male client base. Again, the case files of men are usually referred through formal processes. Self-referral by males is the exception rather than the norm. How can we change this?
And I'm going to expertly bat this one away to CJ. I see he's got his hand up already. I hope that was to answer the question because I was going to throw that one your way anyway.
Very, very much so. And I also come with a little bit of experience with this as well. I've worked directly with Lyra before, as well as one of their telephone counselors as well, and kind of worked in the employee wellness space and with various other companies as well. But the reason I point out to Lyra here, and this is also just saying that they've been doing really wonderful work, but Lyra is the biggest provider for employee wellness in South Africa, and they do handle a lot of the government contracts as well as private. But what I've also realized within that is that, yes, we do primarily get female clientele that call in. Men very rarely call in to employee wellness programs. And it is, I would say, mainly because a lot of men don't see calling a helpline as a practical response, because they don't always feel that they get practical engagement and advice to assist in the moment. And this is one of the uncomfortable things of mental health care, is that it's not a quick fix. It's something that takes a bit of time. I always joke and say that people want the McDonald's drive-through experience of mental health. They're going to want to go from the one window to the next window and drive on with their life. Whereas it's more like an 18-course meal. You have to sit through every meal. Sometimes it's filling, sometimes it's not. Sometimes the food is horrible, and other times you're really feeling like you're engaging with the meal. And it takes time. It's uncomfortable. But for us, I would actually want to stress the importance of mentorship. We as men oftentimes recognize a hierarchical structure. We take mentorship from leaders, from people in positions of power above us. And when our mentors are willing to open up these conversations, our mentors are willing to engage with mental health services, be open about engaging, be open about having these conversations, and the importance of it in being able to develop yourself as a professional, as a person, as a man, by engaging with these services. Not only are we able to start creating that culture within our companies, building towards mental health, but also we recognize that the people we look up to engage with these services. And that normalizes it for us. It is very difficult to go and say that this person who is in the lowest position in the company makes use of the services, which is often the case because usually there is a monetary challenge with making use of services. So employee wellness is the main route. But also to, instead of having to have things escalate to a referral basis, where also bear in mind, oftentimes these men don't want to engage them. They feel forced. And it takes a bit longer, but usually you're able to get to a very nice, comfortable conversation in time. But once mentors are open about it, once the people we look up to are engaging, that starts to make a big difference for us. And that's just us recognizing how power structure works within male cultures.
That's excellent, CJ. And I'm a big advocate for, especially in the workplace, being confidently vulnerable, if I can call it that. As a manager, I speak openly about my mental health, and my hope is that by doing that, I can create a culture where the staff in the organization feel that they are safe and also able to do that. Because, as you said, if it's and I'm not somebody who generally believes in top-down work, but I do believe in a case like this, if you have a management structure and a culture of vulnerability and tolerance for mental health, that will trickle down to your other employees. Michelle, how are we doing for time? We've gone over. Perhaps can we take another 2 questions maybe, and then call it?
I think so. I was going to say that kind of going over time here, but I was wondering, so I would pop your email address into the chat, Leon, and then maybe the speakers can also pop their email addresses into the chat, just because there's a lot of conversation, and I think people would really appreciate being able to contact with their individual questions. But I do see someone, Nelson Msutu, your hand is up. Feel free to unmute, and maybe that could be the last question. And if everyone can put their details into the chat, then we can close.
Okay, thanks, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Michelle, Leon, and obviously the panelists. I do have a bit of a weak signal, so I just hope everybody can hear me. CJ speaks about men asking for assistance is a bit of a strife. And KG speaks about big boys don't cry. And my namesake Nelson speaks about assistance for men is usually through referral and not with men taking initiative. And I can tell you, as somebody that has taken initiative to seek for assistance, that sometimes we as men fall victim to a broken system. And this, in most instances, is the reason that maybe men feel hopelessness when it comes to seeking for assistance. I am a father who has reported, for instance, a matter of child neglect. And I feel like I've been treated as an informant and not as an emotionally affected stakeholder in the whole issue. And this on its own has made me emotionally, and it has affected my well-being. And I feel that I am at risk because I am experiencing bureaucracy in real time where I'm not getting the assistance, I'm not getting the necessary support, and I do feel at times hopeless. So I want to agree with Nelson when he says that maybe perhaps the systems that are currently in place, especially in the townships with organizations that are tasked with this particular work, should relook at exactly the type of support that they are offering, the continuous support to ensure that people like me we don't fall into a pathway of depression or suicide, because as soon as you realize that you are helpless as a father, one of the things that comes up is exactly that. And I believe that it's around the system that's where most issues tend to come from. So just to keep it brief, I think that's all I wanted to say. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nelson. And thank you for sharing so openly. And there has been research that has actually shown that problems when men experience problems like being separated from their children and stuff like that, it can actually be a serious trigger for suicidal behavior and depression and those kind of things. So thank you for being brave. I popped in the chat, you'll see I put the, goodness, where is it now? If you scroll up a bit, it says the SAFMH help desk. If you are in need of some support, please do reach out. We have a help desk and we can link you to services if you ever require. And that goes for everybody else here. I see, CJ, you and KG have hands up. Are those old hands or new hands?
A new one.
Okay, let me. KG, is yours new, old?
We got new hands. I wanted to engage with Nelson for a little bit, if that's
okay.
Yeah.
Can I give each of you like a minute, and then because I'm very conscious of time, we have to sign off. Can I give each of you a minute, and then we'll close off? I'll go with you first, KG.
Yeah, no, I think in terms of what Nelson said, if you remember what I opened with is the father involvement, right? And the things that the father goes through that we don't often see as mental health issues. But again, Nelson, we've got a WhatsApp group where we have dealt with a few of these issues, and we've sent the men, or referred the men to a fatherhood network where they can get support, and a mental health support group where they can get also further support with a personal professional, or whether it is a group of individuals going through similar experiences. So thank you for bringing that, but we do actually deal with that in a different kind of way. And again, acknowledging that the system itself has some flaws, but there are ways to navigate those, because there are organizations that are there to support brothers that are going through exactly what you're experiencing. But thank you for bringing that.
Thanks, KG. And last but certainly not least, CJ, I'm gonna end the session with you.
Yeah, wonderful. So just on a quick point as well from Nelson is that the support structures are oftentimes a challenging one. And I'm actually going to bring in a comment that was in the chat box around disabilities as well, men's mental health, is we oftentimes talk about caregivers or support structures within this, and caregivers burden and burnout, which are terms that we essentially just is that recognition of being a supporter is an extraordinarily difficult position to be in, and oftentimes an unrecognized or overlooked position to be in. And finding that support for yourself can be quite difficult. But also linking that to men with disabilities, specifically, a lot of the work that I do is within palliative care and acquired disability. In fact, it is one of my very unique special interests in mental health and what I've geared a lot of my work and training towards. And there is a very unique side of mental health which comes into just the role that we play, how we see our identity, how we see our sense of worth in the community. Having disabilities or lack of support or being overlooked to a large extent, whether the disabilities be visible or invisible, it becomes a big challenge because we tie our identity again to our sense of worth, our sense of purpose. And when we find that it becomes challenging to provide that for ourselves, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to develop a sense of resilience or a sense of personal pride, or just to look after ourselves in a way that allows for a sense of contentment and prosperity within our life, a quality of life that we enjoy. But definitely, as has been said in the comment, in the next conversation that comes up, it may be a prudent and most definitely important topic to raise into. But just to kind of recognize it a little bit and to state that there definitely are very specific and very definite mental health challenges that come with any chronic diagnosis or disability, acquired disability, that go within men that are very unique as well to men within that. But for now, there is also just that recognition that there are support structures, especially within nonprofits, that specifically work with it. Also, sometimes, interestingly enough, dependent on what kind of disability you may have, there are nonprofits that are geared towards specific disabilities, such as Headway Gauteng with brain injuries, for instance. But for now, I'm so glad that we had this conversation today and that we were able to mention just a few things. And thank you very much, Leon. Apologies for taking a bit longer to answer this one.
That's absolutely fine. Like I said, I could carry on for another 3 hours, but unfortunately we have run out of time. I just want to say thank you again to the amazing panel of speakers that joined me today. Your time and contributions were so much appreciated. As an organization, we really appreciate the work you do, and we'll continue working alongside all of you and tapping into your amazing expertise and experience. And then to our guests, thank you so much for taking the time to join in, to listen, to participate. As I was talking, I saw the chat box just going. That's amazing. I guess that shows we're doing something right. I hope that you found the session informative and that you will take some of the information that you picked up back into your lives, your families, workplaces, your friendship circles. So thank you to all of you. Take care. Please stay safe and all the very best. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Leon. Take care.
Cheers, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers, guys. Thank you so much.
Bye.